Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
You've almost certainly seen these ads. And depending on your financial situation at the time, you've probably considered them. Because when you're staring down a pile of bills and a looming rent deadline, the idea of picking up a few $1,000s for participating in a medical trial can seem like a godsend. And it is for a lot of people, but it's not a long-term solution unless you do it again and again. It turns out that relying on people desperate for money, so desperate that they'll lie to be accepted or hide adverse reactions so they don't get kicked out, creates a lot of problems for these trials. Problems, obviously, for the people who are renting out their bodies repeatedly, but also problems for everyone, from the company conducting the research to the scientists relying on the data, to eventually the people who may end up taking a drug approved based on trials that were conducted on desperate people who really, really needed the money. Not ideal. I'm Jordan Heath-Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Rob Cribb is the director of the Investigative Journalism Bureau at the Toronto Star, as well as an investigative reporter. Hello, Rob.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing really well. Thank you for finding some time. This is a little bit of a disturbing story, I think.
It's been dark. Yeah, it's been a long process. We spent 2.5 years on this story, a pretty impenetrable story, and yeah, pretty dark.
Why don't you start by sort of laying the groundwork on how medical research gets done on humans? Like, how does that process work in general?
Well, it's evolved over time. During the course of our research, we actually discovered that the initial kind of clinical trials testing work in this country was done on prisoners in prisons. And that eventually led to a tremendous amount of consternation and public debate. What we imagine, I think what the average Canadian imagines, is these trials taking place in universities and hospitals, healthcare institutions under rigorous clinical observation, et cetera. And for sure, that's true. There's no question about that. It continues to be true. But there has been the emergence of privately run and operated clinical testing facilities in Canada. And so much of it is happening now. It's actually difficult to know what percentage of it is happening in these private clinical trials because Health Canada itself openly concedes that it doesn't know. It doesn't know how many there are. It doesn't know how many clinical trials are happening in these institutions because largely it's, there is not vigorous federal oversight of this. But we certainly know from the work that we've done over the last 2.5 years that there's a lot of it. And they market aggressively, they recruit aggressively, and they are the places where a tremendous amount of this clinical trial testing happens.
Right.
These are usually phase 1 studies, so the initial studies on a new drug that is, under consideration being proposed. They're tested on healthy individuals to assess their safety. In some cases, it's the first time humans have ingested this cocktail of drugs. And so the results from these kinds of phase 1 studies will then go on and lead to, if successful, of course, they'll lead to subsequent trial phases. But this is the data that, is reviewed for ultimately the approval of drugs that we see on the shelves.
And we'll talk about, how this kind of testing might influence that or not and like the bigger picture connotations here. But first, let's give it a face. You spoke at length with someone named Franco. Tell me about him and what does he do?
Franco is a career professional, self-described guinea pig. So he takes drugs for money as a livelihood, largely. I mean, he'll do odd jobs here and there to supplement his income, but effectively the bulk of his income, his livelihood, comes from signing up for test after test after test. It is the most lucrative way that he has figured out to make a living. He came to Canada, he's an immigrant, didn't have a lot of opportunities, stumbled upon this early in his time in Canada, and ultimately never found anything that could replace it with the same amounts of money.
What kind of money are we talking about here?
You could get as much as $20,000 for a really intensive study where you're spending days and nights living in in the facility for weeks, but much more typically we're looking at, $1,000, a couple $1,000. He told us he will make on a good year, he'll take 30 grand or so in income from this, which he then supplements with other odd jobs. So this is in no way a lavish livelihood, but nevertheless, a very significant portion of a livelihood. And it has created this remarkable kind of subculture of people kind of living on the economic fringes who do this for a living.
Do we know how big a business, for lack of a better term here, this is in Canada, like compared to other countries? Are we a hub for this kind of thing?
Yeah, surprisingly, Canada is a big player in this. Now, obviously, we're a small country relative to others in the G7.
Right.
But 4% of the world's clinical trials happen here. That's per capita, the most in the G7. There's about 1,100 trials approved by Health Canada every year. And that means we actually don't know, again, because Health Canada doesn't know. But on any given day, there could be 2,000 to 3,000 trials happening in this country.
So what kinds of things happen when these trials begin? You mentioned these are people pretty desperate for money. They're taking, again, drugs that perhaps no human has taken before. Like, give me an example, maybe with Franco, of what can go wrong when you enter these.
Yeah, well, lots can go wrong. There is a contract that is signed up front that tells participants potential adverse health events that they could experience from the drugs. And these documents are quite extensive. And I think to most of us, to you and I think we would be highly reluctant to consume them.
Mm-hmm.
But again, this is a very motivated jurisdiction, right? So you have to be healthy. First of all, these are meant to be healthy participants in the trials. And so that poses the first problem for lots of people who rely upon this for a living, right? So what happens if you do have a health condition that would prevent you from getting into a lucrative study that's going to get you $5,000, $10,000? What happens if you use drugs, which is a precursor for filtering you out?
Right.
Any number of things that might prevent you. What are you going to do when you're asked those questions on a form? Well, I can tell you what Franco and many others that we spoke to do. They lie. They have to lie. There's no way around it. In the end, we spoke with more than a dozen what I'd call professional trial participants or regular trial participants, and they all told us at some point, you have to, if you're going to do this repeatedly as a way of making money to survive. So they can lie, they can hide the fact that they use specific drugs, and it's all for the purpose of getting approved. Like the big goal is to get approved. So you apply to get in, and then you have to, in some cases, do blood tests and things. If you get in, you're inside, right? And so some of these can run for a couple of days. Some of them can run for a couple of months.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're on the inside, you're on a very strict regimen. The medications are delivered to you and into you at a regular frequency. In some cases, you're all wearing the same kind of clothing, or you have a trial number participant. You're referred to by your number rather than your name. And some of them actually describe it as a kind of prison, right? And it does feel that way. And we've looked at photos from the inside. There is a prison-like nature to it. It's boring. And in some cases, it is dangerous. So Franco, for example, suffered quite a serious adverse event during our reporting process,
wow,
which led him to be taken to hospital, diagnosed. It seems clear that the drug he was taking was the cause of it. He's okay, but it was a serious, obviously, incident. So there's a lot of drama to all of this,
yeah,
and a fascinating kind of human nature question about why and what is ultimately the obligations of both the system and Health Canada.
You've mentioned a couple times now that Health Canada kind of has a loose hold on what's going on there. How exactly is this business regulated? What are they doing? What's the process?
Well, they approved the testing, of course. They have a staff of inspectors. Unfortunately, the staff of inspectors is about 11 or 12. So it's about a dozen people in Canada employed by Health Canada to actually show up and inspect the trials. And as I mentioned earlier, on any given day, again, we don't know, but there's thousands of trials. So it is a tiny, tiny percentage of trials that ever get eyeballs from Health Canada on them. So, for example, last year, they inspected 65 trials. And we've looked at the results of those inspections, and that in of itself is really interesting. There's repeated violations of research and ethics protocols. They're quite common. We looked at a review of 460 trials between 2012 and 2021 with over 3,600 infractions.
Mm-hmm.
So, like bad things can happen to these trials. There can be breaches of confidentiality, there can be breaches of health protocols, et cetera. And again, we only have the tiniest fragment at the top of the iceberg that's visible to the public. The rest is all underwater.
It's one thing to discuss, the adverse effects this can have on people who are desperate for money and sign up for this stuff. But in the macro, if people are lying on forms or not reporting effects and stuff like that, what kind of impact can that have on the actual research that is supposedly being done here to eventually make these drugs safe for the public?
Yeah, I would say that is the number one kind of question that's emerged in response to our reporting. And I've heard from dozens of academics and clinical researchers asking that very question is, how can this be happening? Quite apart from the human toll on these participants, the bigger question, I think, societally is, what does this mean for the data?
Mm-hmm.
Because this is important stuff. These clinical trials have tremendous impact on the development of drugs. If adverse events are not recorded, if the science is tainted by participants whose bodies are not what they said they were, that raises very, very serious questions, which we posed, to Health Canada and others. And there has never been a clear response to that question. And let me give you an example of how this can happen. So Franco, for example, use him for an example. He's in a trial and he has an adverse event. So he now has a choice to make. He can report that event, say, look, I'm feeling sick. But if he does that, he's likely to be almost certainly going to be removed from the trial. And the way it's set up in terms of the payment monetarily is he then loses the remainder of his payment. So you get paid in stages. So let's say he's in a big trial that's worth $10,000, and on day 3, he gets sick. Is he likely to step forward and say, look, I'm having abdominal cramps from this drug, knowing that means he's going to walk out the door in an hour and he's going to leave $7,000 on the table? The answer is no. Mm-hmm. This is his livelihood. So what is he most likely to do? He's likely to just suck it up, say nothing, everything's fine.
Right.
It is only in the most extreme case, the one I just mentioned to you, where he had to go to hospital effectively. He was told, in that case, he had no choice. But what he'll say is, I am not going to report voluntarily almost ever. I'm going to shut up and go through. So then what does that mean to the science? If there's a whole bunch of people inside getting abdominal cramps from a drug and all of them are shutting up about it because they can't lose the $7,000 they need to make rent this month, well, then what's that doing to the data?
Right.
And is it possible that data is so tainted that it's going to move into further development and ultimately this very serious adverse event is overlooked?
How is this different then from the other trials that we've talked about in hospitals? I know if people ride the subway here in Toronto, you will often see requests from places like CAMH for people to participate in a research study. What's the difference between that and the ones you're discussing?
Well, on their face, they're similar. They're very similar. So there's lots of testing done in hospitals in Toronto, for example. CAMH is one of them, sick kids for sure. The difference is really in the details. So the level of remuneration is lower, typically. You have to pay people for their time. There's no question about it. Mm-hmm. The questions around this are the type and extent of the remuneration, right? So the private ones tend to pay more. It is more profitable for people like Franco, for example, to do this in the private, we call CROs. That's the first thing. There's also a very sophisticated recruitment process in the privates that you do not see in the CAMHs and the sick kids of the world. So, for example, sign up today and win a chance to get a free iPad. We'll pay you on a debit card so you don't need a bank account. If you do a certain number of tests, almost like a coffee card, you get preferential treatment and you get free parking. And if you bring a friend, you get a bonus. So it really is a little bit, like product marketing, old school product marketing. But what we're talking about here is people's bodies. So every sort of medical ethicists that we talked to about this, and we showed them the ads and the recruitment materials, and to a person, they all expressed deep discomfort with the recruitment materials and the process and the offerings that are given to prospective trial volunteers. And again, there appears to be very little or no regulation of that. I mean, this is all happening. It's very public. There's no secrets around this. As you say, it's posted on university campus bulletin boards and on the subways and telephone poles. There's nothing secret about this, but there's certainly been, to our knowledge, there's been no action taken by anybody about it.
Well, and this is where I was going to ask you, what did you hear, if anything, from the companies that run these clinics or these trials? First of all, what did they say if you asked them stuff? But also, are they doing anything technically wrong? We can talk to ethicists and we can talk about morals, but they're not breaking any of our laws, right?
It's gray. It's one of those fascinating stories. In an industry that is obviously very, very highly regulated. We're talking about drug development. We're talking about human trials. I mean, one would expect, and certainly my thinking on this as the typical Canadian coming into this story, I just thought, there's no way. It's impossible. Could we imagine a more sort of clinical, rigorous, scientific area of inquiry than human trials? And yet, the more we peeled back the layers on this, when you get down to it, there is a tremendous amount of gray and lack of oversight and lack of regulation. Now, Health Canada will tell you the exact opposite, right? So we went to them and they certainly say that they rigorously oversee clinical trials and work to protect the health and safety of the participants. They're saying that they're going to publish some new regulations next year that will further tighten what they're doing and frankly align with some of the other Western countries that are doing more on this, by the way. I mean, it's clear that Health Canada is by no means leading the rigorous oversight movement here. The companies themselves say, they actually said very little to us, Jordan. I'll be honest with you. We spent a lot of time trying to seek comment and interviews from them. We got, little or nothing in terms of substantive response to our reporting, which is kind of unfortunate. But, are they breaking any rules? I mean, there's two ways to measure that. Have they been charged with anything? Have they been disciplined? Has there been any actions taken by any regulatory authority? No. Nothing that we can find. So technically, the answer to your question is no, they're not breaking any rules. But do they breach sort of fundamental medical ethics standards and protocols? I mean, the answers to that we got from the people that are most equipped to answer that question would say, yeah, there are elements of this recruitment. There's elements to the fact that payment is delayed until the end, which obviously creates an overwhelming motivation for the participant to shut up and stick around. Yeah, those things, those are inducements that are, that do not align with the principles of medical research.
So what are the other Western countries you mentioned that are ahead of us on this doing to make the data better, make the participants safer?
Yeah, so we looked at a couple. In France, for example, they have a government registry established under the law that caps compensation for participants. One of the ways that participants break the rules and lie is something called like a 30-day washout period. So what that means is you do a test, a trial, you consume drugs, you finish the trial. You're now supposed to wait 30 days before entering into a new trial. And the point of that, of course, is to allow the drugs that are in your body to remove themselves so that you can enter a new study without the residue of those drugs potentially tainting the new data.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the catch. Typically, nobody's checking. There's no federal oversight of that. There's been a few private industry attempts using fingerprint technology to keep track of where you go. So if you do a test today in Toronto and then you decide, well, I'm going to go to Montreal tomorrow with my friends, and often they all pack up in the same bus and they go up the road to Montreal where there's also a lot of testing, and they start a new test the next day. There is virtually every chance that they're going to be able to do that without any question. And it's because there's no registry. There's nobody making sure that you are going to stay clean from trials for 30 days. France, they do that. The UK, Health Research Authority, for all phase 1 trials, they have a prevention system, a national database verified through insurance numbers, so the equivalent of our health cards. So they're able to monitor this kind of thing. So it's doable. There's no question it's doable. We just haven't done it.
So while we wait, I guess, for the new Health Canada regulations, last question, what happened to Franco? He had a really serious reaction. He was in the hospital. What did he do next?
Yeah, it was scary. And again, this was all happening while we were talking to him regularly. He called us from the hospital. We talked to him. And so he was assessed by a doctor, spent basically a day in the hospital. They did some tests. His doctor's assessment essentially that he had indeed suffered a health problem based upon the drugs. It was one of the known side effects of this cocktail of drugs. And he was released. He's okay. And of course, our first question to him was, so that's a scary thing. Are you done? And, he wavered a little bit, I think, at first. And he certainly doesn't want to continue to do this. But I can tell you that he's back doing it.
Wow.
He's back in the study as we speak today. There just isn't another way for him. He certainly hasn't found another way to make a living in the way that he can doing this. So it has become sort of this unquenchable need to continue. So he continues to be doing it.
That's quite a story, Rob. Thank you for shedding light, you and the team, on these practices. I think it's going to come as pretty shocking to a lot of people.
Thanks for asking. I appreciate it. We're really happy to share it with you.
Rob Cribb of the Investigative Journalism Bureau and the Toronto Star. That was The Big Story. For more, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. And of course, you can also find a Contact Us form on that website if you want to write in, or just email us. hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or you can even give us a call, 416-935-5935, and leave a voicemail. The Big Story is available in every single podcast player, and that includes Seeker, Seekr. If you haven't given it a try, maybe take a look. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.